Hello and welcome to the PGRO and Syngenta Roadshow for 2023. As part of that, I'll be telling you about the PGRO Pulse variety evaluations. And by that, I mean we're going to be talking about how different variety work is done at PGRO, specifically focusing on how we end up with the descriptive list. So here we've got on screen some of the different types of variety trials that we do. As part of this, there is a descriptive list, but we're also involved in the national list work and some screening trials, as well as private variety work. So now on the screen is some of the numbers for the last couple of years. So these numbers are numbers of plots that we've tested in those respective seasons. But a key thing to point out there that under the descriptive list trials, those plots are the trials that PGRO are running in-house. But there's also, as part of the descriptive list process, we contract out to other sites as well. So there's even more plots involved in the final data set. Then as for the national list and screening trials, we're involved in less work for those, as you can see on the screen. But the private variety trial work is incredibly popular. With most years, we've got about 1,700 plots being done. So a little bit about those other trials. So as I said, we're involved with the national list work. This is administered by BSPB on behalf of AFA. So we're involved in running a trial in each of the different crops. So that's winter beans, spring beans, and combining peas. But we also get involved with the inspections and sit on the panels. And as part of this, one of the very good things that is coordinated together is that national list procedures are very similar to the protocols for the descriptive list. This means that data can be shared between the two different trial systems, and that we can also run combined trials at certain sites where they're all grown together at the same location, and then the data can be looked at alongside each other. Screening trials is just another piece of variety work we do. This is often for companies that are breeding new material, but they're not at the level in their breeding program where they're going on to the NL and DL trials. For this, we only usually get a few beans that are then put alongside one of the descriptive list bean trials. We usually get enough peas to have its own independent screening trial. As I said on the previous slide, we have lots of different private variety trials with different breeders. And as part of this, we're able to act as effectively an even larger screening trial for some of the bigger breeders for them to look at new material that might be of interest, that will hopefully then go forward and be available via the NL and DL and then to farmers in the future. But this also lets us sort of adjust what we're doing and what we're measuring to really suit those individual breeders. So focusing in on the descriptive list, so we're involved in administrating and running the descriptive list for both winter beans, spring beans, and combining peas. And this is coordinated by us all at PGRO. So these are sort of spread out across the country, and I'll show you on the next screen whereabouts the trials are. But one of the key things to emphasize is that we're not just showing in like the 2023 list the data collected in 2022. We're constantly working on a 5-year rolling average. So this means that the individual numbers that you see on the list have got several years worth going into those seasons, but also they are dropping off old years and staying updated so that they're hitting sort of current climate and weather conditions in the recent past, rather than having lots of historical data in them. But again, I'll talk more about that in a second. As part of that, we also use a basket of controls. So by that, I mean that we're not just using one or two varieties, that everything is then relative to, where then if there's a problem with that variety, or the control numbers could shift in an unpredictable way. We've moved into having our control set being all varieties that have been on the list for 4 or 5 years, so that then everything is kind of compared to an average for the currently trusted varieties, rather than just compared to one variety that may have a good or a bad year. So you may sort of think of this list still as the recommended list. It's only been a couple of years since we switched over to calling it the descriptive list. That does also come alongside 1 or 2 changes. We've changed how the controls are done slightly, and we now don't drop things off the list if they don't meet a certain yield standard. Instead, we drop things off the list based on discussion with the relevant breeders, discussion about other traits of interest that may support them being included, even if their yield is not up the very top. And effectively, breeders sort of drop things off the list in discussion with us when they seem to, they're not going to be supported anymore and they're not going to be available as seed. I will just say, though, even though we have changed the list in that way, the data collection, the data gathering, the way that the traits are all put together is still at the same high quality and rigor that it always has been throughout the recommended lists period. So here on the screen, we've got the locations used in the last season, with red being the peas, blue being the winter beans, and green being the spring beans. And you see that we have spread ourselves quite out over the country to hit a lot of the major growing areas for the different crops and to make sure we're hitting a wide range of different soil types and weather conditions. See, we're slightly further spread out in the spring beans, able to go slightly further north and further to the southwest and things, but we're hitting sort of most major types of soil and a good geographic spread across the country for all three different types. As I said earlier, PGRO administers the ones that are close to us. So the region, the ring of the high density ones around Peterborough are all run by PGRO itself. But then the further away trials are contracted out to other people to run, but are still inspected by us at PGRO to make sure that they're hitting the standard required. On the screen now, some of the different traits that we're looking at and that will end up going onto the list. So we're always checking the plant population early in the season, just so that then we can spot any problems early on with germination or the sowing, so that then that data can be taken out and doesn't then impact the yield if there was an issue with the sowing. We'll also look at winter hardiness, see if any of the varieties have different levels of frost tolerance. Then going in through the season, we'll be scoring the final haulm length. We're looking at any relevant diseases, looking at maturity, and then around harvest, we'll check their standing at harvest, and then go on and take all the yield and protein traits that become part of the final content on the list. So this is quite a busy slide here now, but this is sort of discussing that sort of 5-year rolling data set that I mentioned. So if you look under sort of the current year section, that's what we've just been discussing, that we've got all these locations across the country, all of which are then going to go into a yearly data set. But as I kind of said before, this data is also checked and validated. So if any individual site has had bad drilling or a problem early on establishing, that site then won't be forced into the data set and lower the averages. That data will be checked and removed. And that can happen at a site basis if it's a problem with the whole site, or on a plot basis if something particularly has gone wrong with a plot that has unduly affected things. So within an individual year, you'll have what sites move forward to the final set going forward. But then, as I said, we're not just looking at 1 year, we're going to be looking at the last 5 years. So we've got 5 years in the data set. So this makes the data a lot more reliable than it otherwise would be, and means any individual unusual weather events, unusual dry periods around sowing or something in a particular season that then goes on to impact the yield, that isn't sort of really heavily changing the list for that 1 year and then disappearing. We've got these 5 years all put together so that you know that the individual data you're seeing in the final list is really reliable. For new varieties, because the NL procedures are like the DL protocols, we are able to include some NL data when things are first going onto the list to form part of that 5 years. But as varieties have been on the list for longer and longer, and they have 5 years just of descriptive list work, the NL stuff is dropped off the data set for them. So talking about diseases, so we're off looking out in the field throughout the season, doing inspections, looking for the start of any diseases starting to develop. So of course, we'll be looking at chocolate spot, bean rust, and both kinds of mildew especially. For this, we've got a sort of a minimum criteria of 5% infection to be performing the assessment. So things aren't just going to be on the data, including the data. If everything is clean apart from one tiny speck, that's not going on the list into the data as that variety is suddenly terrible relative to the others. We've got to have this minimum of 5% before we're then collecting this set of data. The data is also collected across whole plots at a time. So if you've got an unusual sort of peak in one region of a plot, that's averaged out over the plot before things go forward. And the thing to emphasize here is also that these are managed trials. So these trials aren't typically sprayed for everything, and we see gets what's through the sprayed, but they're also not left to sort of let the disease run wild. So what happens is that when disease, say, bean rust is spotted at a certain location, we'll go to that location, we'll perform an assessment in all the plots, that data will be going into the data set, but then we'll arrange for the trial to be sprayed so that the final yield isn't unduly impacted by letting the disease run rampant either. So as part of that, when we're looking at field infection, we're not going to be getting all diseases in all fields each season. So this means that then there's less data going into the disease work. To help compensate for this, for the downy mildew in peas and spring beans, there is also polytunnel testing performed at 9 of each season. So then that means if we're only getting downy mildew data from some of the fields, we've also always got this infected work in the polytunnel alongside 4 or 5 years that goes into the data set, which then helps you sort of trust the disease data that it has enough data going into the final ratings that are produced. On that same front, this then means we're in the situation that some diseases we get a little bit of data on, but not enough to trust putting it on the list as a rating. Say if we have a disease only occurs at 1 or 2 sites within the last 5 years, we need a certain threshold of data before we decide that we trust it enough to put it on the list. On this note, winter beans have not historically had downy mildew ratings, and they do on the 2023 list. This is because we've just had enough sites with enough levels of downy mildew on winter beans that we trust the data enough to put it forward for everyone to view. On this note, we will say that that winter bean data is analysed and looked at separately to the spring bean downy mildew data, which then means that the ratings aren't directly comparable. So a 7 out of 9 for spring bean downy mildew is not the exact same level of disease as a 7 in winter bean downy mildew. They're done relative within the populations, so you shouldn't directly compare them. Also on the screen at the moment, I've got some unusual rust plots to show from 2020. So as in 2020, they're still within the data set. Here is a season where we got incredibly bad spring bean rust, and all the main varieties were covered, but we had these lines here that were in screening that year that stayed remarkably clean, which is a good sign and a good point of hope that, you know, there is new resistance being built into the pea and bean populations by breeders regularly. It's something that there's a lot of work put into, and that as new material from breeders is bred into the higher yielding lines, good resistance should be coming through onto the list in the future. So here is an example of the descriptive list for winter beans on the screen now. So this is the Excel version. There is also a PDF version, which is formatted slightly differently. The data is all the same. So you can get this Excel version from our website. And I wanted to just point out that one of the reasons to look at the Excel one rather than the PDF one is that you have the ability to filter the list and perform searches within it. So you've got these little drop-down bars here that you can then go and look for certain maturities or certain disease ratings to then sort of filter through the data more easily. As for reading the list itself, everything is listed in yield order from top to bottom, and things also will be highlighted up when they're of the new varieties that have been added just in the recent year. Also available, if you look at the Excel version online, is that you can look at a summary of the last 5 years. So this isn't available in the magazine or in the PDF, but you can find this on our website, where if you're interested in the breakdown over the last 5 years, what were the yields in the individual years, how consistent has it seemed, were there any sort of years that you can sort of look at what the weather was like and how things have changed. If you're interested in that, that data is all available if you want to look at the consistency of the data. So then again, talking about the new resistances available and the prospect of having cleaner varieties in general from disease, I've put up some of the most promising ones on the screen. So as I said, for winter beans, we're now showing downy mildew on the list and rust on the list that we didn't used to. with Vincent and Norton standing out as being the better varieties for Downy mildew. For rust and winter beans, whilst we've got enough data to put it on the list now, all of them have got very similar rating. For spring beans, for Downy mildews, Yukon is the standout with a rating of 9, but Lynx and Maraspeed are both very good with ratings of 7. For rust on spring beans, we've got LG Viper and Macho are the highest rating ones on the list, though as I just showed you in that other image, there's hopefully the potential of other good ratings coming forward in the future if things can stay as clean as those screening lines that I showed you. For combining peas, both of the maple peas, Rose and Mantara, have very good ratings for Downy mildew. We've got Riverley with a rating of 8, and Carrington and Bluto and Aviator in the green peas also having ratings of 8. Powdery mildew, we've now got 4 varieties that aren't considered susceptible, with 3 being sort of highly resistant and manager being medium moderate resistance, that are all available if powdery mildew is a particular problem in your field setup. So as I said, you can download the descriptive list information from the PGRO website, and as part of that, you can see the Excel version, which breaks down the data in slightly further. But you can also see a video of me discussing the list and highlighting interesting varieties of notes from the list in greater detail than is covered in this presentation. You can also find the list in the winter issue of the Pulse magazine and on the PGRO app. One of the things about using the app or checking the website is that the list has this season and occasionally previous seasons been updated since the magazine population. We had 3 varieties that were good enough to be going on the descriptive list, but didn't have national list status at the time of publication, that have then subsequently been granted national list status. So there's 3 more spring beans on the list now online than was initially put out when the list was launched in November 2022. So I recommend having a look at the list to see the new varieties. So if you've got any questions about how the descriptive list data is put together, how the field work is done, or just are keen to talk about peas and bean varieties in general with me, you can contact me at the details on the screen. Thank you very much.